topic for today is the gastrointestinal system. As always, we will be discussing it under the four headings of embryology, anatomy, physiology, and pathology. There are 2 points from embryology that we will go through. The first is regarding the derivatives. So, just by way of recall, there are 3 germ layers from which the rest of the body develops: the ectoderm, the endoderm, and the mesoderm. The derivatives of the endoderm include the GI tract proper, from the mouth to the anus, glands of the GI tract, the liver, pancreas, and finally the trachea. The mesoderm derivatives include the surrounding tissue like the muscles, the peritoneum, and a special organ called the spleen. The second point is regarding the division of the GI tract from the mouth to the anus. The foregut starts from the oral cavity and goes up to the duodenum. The midgut is between the duodenum and the transverse colon, and the hindgut is between the transverse colon and the rectum. The important correlation that has to be made is that the arterial supply for each of these parts or each of these divisions is by a different artery. I have a picture of the GI tract here to demonstrate these divisions. The foregut starts at the oral cavity and continues up to the duodenum, and this part is known as the foregut. The midgut is between the duodenum and the transverse colon, and the hindgut is the final section, which is between the transverse colon and the anus, and this is. With the next section, we will go into the anatomy of the GI tract. The first part that we learn about is the oral cavity, which begins at the lips and ends at the pharynx, and it includes the teeth and the tongue. The human set of teeth have 3 identifying features, and these are thecodont, diffeodont, and heterodont. And let's take a second to understand each of these terms. Thecodont implies that the teeth are embedded in a set of jaws. Diffeodont implies that there are 2 sets of teeth that are seen in a lifetime, the temporary and the permanent set. And heterodont refers to the fact that the human teeth consists of a variety of teeth. And these are the incisors, the canines, the premolars, and the molars. There are 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 1 molar in each quadrant of the mouth, and this gives the dental formula, which is 2123 by 2123. The teeth performs a very important function known as mastication or chewing, which is defined as the crushing of food. This also happens to be the first step in the process of digestion, wherein it helps increase the surface area of food to be acted upon by enzymes. The next structure that we'll talk about is the tongue. The tongue is a muscular organ attached to the floor of the mouth by a structure called frenulum. There are small projections which cover the tongue, and these projections are called papillae, which bear the different taste buds. This is a picture of the tongue to help visualize the frenulum, and here you can see the frenulum. The oral cavity ends at the pharynx. This continues on as the esophagus. To recollect, the pharynx serves as a passage for both air and food. The air passes into the trachea, whereas the food passes through the esophagus into the stomach. The trachea is covered by a fold called the epiglottis, which covers the trachea during the event of swallowing to prevent the entry of food. And finally, the journey of food starts at the oral cavity and moves into the esophagus, which is then stored in the stomach for a while to continue into the intestines. So let's go through these points together. First, the oral cavity opens into the pharynx. The oral cavity, the epiglottis is a cartilaginous flap which prevents the entry of food into the trachea during swallowing. Esophagus is a thin, long tube which passes through the neck, thorax, and pierces the diaphragm to enter into the stomach. The esophagus ends at the gastroesophageal sphincter. So, a sphincter is a tight muscle which can open or close a tube-like structure. Since the whole of the GI tract is a long tube, we will learn about several sphincters in this topic. Again, just to recollect, the esophagus ends at the gastroesophageal sphincter, and this transforms the stomach into a closed chamber along with the pyloric sphincter. The next section in anatomy is the stomach. So there are 4 parts to the stomach: the fundus, the cardiac, the body, and the pylorus, and I've demonstrated each of these parts in the first figure. The gastroesophageal sphincter guards the opening to the stomach, and here you can visualize the gastroesophageal sphincter. There is a second sphincter called the pyloric sphincter, and this controls the release of the stomach contents into the duodenum. Since I mentioned the duodenum, I will use the next picture to explain about the small intestine and subsequently the duodenum. The small intestine is made of 3 parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum is a C-shaped tube, and we will use this picture to understand a small point. So, firstly, the duodenum is this C-shaped tube. The small point that I mentioned was there is a special opening in the duodenum called the ampulla of Vater. So here is the ampulla of Vater. This opening is guarded by the sphincter of Oddi. And the reason this opening is very important is because the pancreas, which is an abdominal organ, has a major which has a major role in the digestion of food, releases its juices through a tube called the pancreatic duct into the duodenum through the ampulla of Vater. So let's very quickly review these points. The stomach is a J-shaped bag-like structure. It is divided into cardiac, fundus, body, and pylorus. Moving on into the small intestine is divided into a C-shaped duodenum, a jejunum, and an ileum. Structures which open into the duodenum are: the first one is the pylorus of the stomach. Second is the pancreatic duct, which opens at the ampulla of Vater. This ampulla of Vater is guarded by the sphincter of Oddi. After the small intestine, let's continue the journey through the large intestine. The large intestine is divided into 3 parts, and these are the cecum, the colon, and the rectum. So just to look at the diagram of the parts of the large intestine, the first part is the cecum, and this is the part where the ileum opens into. The cecum is a blind sac, and this hosts several symbiotic organisms. The vermiform appendix is a finger-like projection arising from the cecum, and this happens to be a vestigial organ, and here is the picture of the vermiform appendix. An important correlation that can be made to the vermiform appendix is that there is a condition called appendicitis, which is inflammation of the appendix, and this presents as a severe abdominal pain. The treatment normally is a procedure called appendectomy, where the appendix is surgically removed. The next part of the large intestine, is the colon, which is further divided into ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon. And just to go through these, the ascending colon is here, the transverse, the descending, and finally the sigmoid colon. The last part is the rectum, and this opens into the anal canal, and here you have the anus or the anal canal. In this section, we will learn about the tissue structure of the GI tract in a subject known as histology. So histology is a branch of anatomy which deals with the tissue structure of an organ or an organ system, and this is in fact a major subject in your medical school. So the walls of the GI tract, starting from the esophagus until the anus, are composed of 4 layers. These are the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa. And from inner to outer, you can picturize this as the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa. The mucosa is the only differentiating part of among all the 4 layers. This means that for us to identify or differentiate the tissue as any given tissue as esophagus or stomach or intestine, is we will need to take a closer look at the mucosal layer, as the other 3 layers of the GI tract are going to be very similar. The second regarding the mucosa is that they contain multiple glands. Submucosa is the connective tissue layer, and it contains multiple nerves, blood vessels, and lymph. The glands of duodenum, which are called the Brunner's glands, are present in the submucosa, and this instead of the mucosa, and this serves as a major exception to the first mucosa rule that I stated. The third layer is the muscularis, and this layer is divided into an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer. The serosa is the outermost layer, and it secretes a lubricating fluid, and this is the only important point that you need to know about the serosa. Let's learn about the mucosa in a little more detail, focusing specifically on how to identify whether a given mucosal layer is from the esophagus, stomach, or the intestine. The mucosa of the esophagus is made of stratified squamous epithelium. This is the same tissue that lines our skin, the only difference being that the esophagus is made of non-keratinized cells while the skin is made of keratinized cells. The stomach mucosa is made of simple columnar epithelium, and they contain the gastric glands. The small intestinal mucosa is also made of simple columnar epithelium. It contains 2 special structures which differentiate it from the rest of the GI tract. The first structure is the villi, which is a finger-like extension into the lumen. The second is a crypt, which is present at the base. So the villi, which is a finger-like projection, helps increase the surface area for absorption. And here is a picture of the small intestinal mucosa to demonstrate the villi and the crypts. The villi also contain small microvilli, which help further increase the surface area for absorption. In the next couple of slides, we will walk through the different exocrine glands of the gastrointestinal system. By way of review, an exocrine gland is one which releases its secretions into a tube or a duct, unlike the endocrine gland, which releases the hormones directly into the bloodstream. The first gland that we'll talk about is the salivary gland. There are 3 pairs of salivary glands, and the main function of which is to produce saliva. The 3 glands are the parotid gland, which is present in the cheek area, the submandibular gland, which is present in the lower jaw, and the sublingual gland, which is present below the tongue. So a little bit of pop culture reference. This here is an episode of the show Brooklyn Nine-Nine. The premise of this episode is that the protagonist, Jake, and his boss, Captain Holt, are infected by the disease mumps. This disease normally affects the parotid gland, and here you can see that both of them have a parotid swelling. And this swelling is present in the cheek area to remind you that the parotid is present in the cheek. Also, for those who haven't yet watched the show, it is a must watch from me. The next gland that we will talk about is the liver. The liver is the largest gland in the body, weighing at about 1.2 to 1.5 kilos. The liver is made of two lobes, and it is divided into smaller structural units called the hepatic lobules. The lobules are covered by a thin connective tissue called the Glissen's capsule, and the lobules contain hepatic cells or hepatocytes. The hepatocytes secrete bile, which secrete a substance called bile. So I'll explain a little more about bile and its role in digestion in the next couple of slides. Right now we need to know that bile is produced by the hepatocytes. It is carried by the hepatic duct and it is stored in an organ called the gallbladder. The liver contains hepatocytes which each produce bile, and here is a picture of the liver with the hepatocytes producing bile. The bile is carried by the right and the left hepatic duct and is stored in an organ called the gallbladder, and this here is the picture of the gallbladder. The gallbladder has a duct for itself, and this duct is called the cystic duct. Whenever bile is called upon for its role in digestion, it is released by the gallbladder into the cystic duct. Along with the hepatic duct, the cystic duct forms another duct called the common bile duct. This common bile duct joins the secretions of the pancreas at the pancreatic duct, and they together open into the duodenum at the ampulla of Vater, which is something that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. So I've summarized the flow of bile in the flow chart. So the bile moves from the hepatocytes into the hepatic duct. This then is stored in the gallbladder, and the duct for the gallbladder is the cystic duct. Together, the hepatic and the cystic duct form the common bile duct, which joins the pancreatic duct and opens at the ampulla of Vater. I'm very sorry for the spelling error. The ampulla of Vater should be spelled with a V. Finally, the ampulla of Vater is guarded by the sphincter of Oddi, and this opens into the duodenum. The last gland that we will discuss is the pancreas. The pancreas is called a compound organ because it has both exocrine and endocrine function. The pancreas is found in between the duodenum. The exocrine portion of the pancreas secretes an alkaline pancreatic juice which aids in the process of digestion, and it secretes enzymes. To learn more about the endocrine part of the pancreas, I suggest you to watch my video on the endocrine system. In this section, we will learn about the physiology of the gastrointestinal system. The two main functions of the gastrointestinal system are digestion and absorption. And let us understand the process of digestion in the next couple of sections. So the process of digestion involves breakdown of complex substances into simple ones. And let's take a second to understand this concept. So to pull up a white screen here, there are three main components in our food, and these are carbohydrates, protein, and fat, which require breakdown into more simple substances. So there are other components like the vitamins, electrolytes, and water, and these don't require breakdown, and these are directly absorbed. But proteins, carbohydrates, and fat require a breakdown into its simple form. So to understand what the simple form of these are, carbohydrates are broken down into its monosaccharide or a single sugar unit form, and these include glucose, galactose, and fructose. And these are the three monosaccharides which the carbohydrates are normally broken down into. Proteins are broken down into its simplest form, and this is known as the amino acid. And finally, fats are broken down into its simplest form, and this is known as fatty acid and glycerol. And these are the two components of the breakdown of fat. So going back to the last slide. Yeah. So I have here summarized the process of digestion along with the enzymes which are involved in the process of digestion, the function of each enzyme, the starting product, and finally the end product. So starting with the oral cavity or the buccal cavity, saliva is the enzyme, is the product which is secreted by the salivary glands. The components of saliva include electrolytes like sodium, potassium, chloride, and bicarbonate, and an enzyme called salivary amylase. So there are two functions of the saliva. The first function is lubricating and sticking the masticated food. This transforms the food into something known as a bolus, which helps in easy passage through the esophagus. The second function of saliva is because of the enzyme present, and the enzyme is known as salivary amylase. This enzyme helps in the breakdown of starch into its simple form, which is known as maltose, and this is a disaccharide. Moving on to the next part of digestion. This occurs in the stomach. So the stomach mucosa by way of recollection contains gastric glands. There are three types of cells which are seen in the gastric glands, and these are the mucous neck cell, the peptic cell, and the parietal cell. So the mucous neck cell, as the name suggests, secretes mucus and bicarbonate. Peptic cells secrete pepsinogen, which is an enzyme helping in the process of digestion, and parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. The mucus and the bicarbonate secreted from the mucous neck cells protect the mucosa from the acidic damage due to the acid produced. Pepsinogen, which is an inactive enzyme secreted by the peptic cells, are converted to pepsin, which is the active form by the action of hydrochloric acid, and this helps in the breakdown of protein. And finally, intrinsic factor helps in the absorption of vitamin B12. So the starting product in the stomach is protein, and this is broken down into a more simple form, which is known as the peptone. So an important point here is renin is an enzyme which is produced in babies, and this helps in the digestion of milk protein, and this is something that you have to remember. The third part of digestion occurs due to the exocrine secretion of the pancreas. So a key distinction to be made here is that the pancreas produces the enzymes which are released into the duodenum, and so the digestion process occurs in the intestine or the duodenum and not the pancreas. The pancreas secretes all of its enzymes in an inactive state. And there are 4 groups of enzymes which are produced. Each group digests a specific component of food. The first group includes enzymes like trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, and procarboxypeptidase. The second group consists of amylase. The third group is nucleases, and the fourth group is lipases. The first group of enzymes are all inactive enzymes, and the activator enzyme for this is a special enzyme called enterokinase. Enterokinase activates trypsinogen to form trypsin, and a special property is that enterokinase only has to activate trypsin, which can then further activate chymotrypsin and chymotrypsinogen to form chymotrypsin, and procarboxypeptidase to form carboxypeptidase. So going into the function of each of these groups, the first group helps in digestion of protein. and it helps in breakdown of protein and peptides into something known as a dipeptide. The second group helps in breakdown of starch into something known as a disaccharide. The third group, or which is the nucleases, helps in the breakdown of nucleic acids like DNA and RNA into its simpler form, which is nucleotides and nucleosides. And finally, lipases help in the breakdown of fat into di and monoglycerides, which can. Next, we will talk about the liver and its role in digestion. The liver secretes a compound called bile, which is made of bile salts and bile pigments. Bile salts are synthesized from cholesterol, whereas bile pigments are breakdown products of hemoglobin, and they include bilirubin and biliverdin. The function of bile lies in fat digestion, wherein it is involved in a process called the emulsification of fat. And let's take a second to understand this. Fat and water are immiscible liquids. This means that fat which is present in food cannot mix with the watery juices of the pancreas and intestine, thereby preventing the process of fat digestion from occurring. This is solved by coating of a fat molecule with bile, making the fat soluble in the liquids and converting the fat molecule into a soluble thing called micelle. The last part of digestion occurs in the intestinal secretions. These are secreted by two cells, which are the goblet cells and the brush border cells. The goblet cells secrete mucus, whereas the brush border cells secrete a group of enzymes, and these are the disaccharides, the dipeptidases, lipases, and nucleosidases. Disaccharides are further divided into maltase, lactase, and sucrase. So let's take a second to understand each of these, the functions of each of these enzymes. Maltose, which is a disaccharide, is broken down by maltase into glucose and glucose. Lactase breaks down lactose into glucose and galactose, and sucrase breaks down sucrose into glucose and fructose. Dipeptidases break down dipeptides into its simplest form, which is the amino acid. Nucleotidases and nucleosidases help in the breakdown of nucleotide into its most simplest form, which is a sugar and a base. And finally, lipases break down di and monoglycerides into the simplest forms of fat, which are fatty acid and glycerol. Let's understand the control of the GI tract. The GI tract is under both neural and hormonal control. For neural, there is a special nerve called the vagus, which is also the 10th cranial nerve. And so the sight, smell, and or presence of food in the GI tract stimulate the secretions of the glands of the GI tract, which include the salivary, the stomach, and the intestine. The second function of the vagus nerve is that it also controls the muscular activity of the different parts of the GI tract. Coming to the hormonal control, there are certain hormones which are produced by the gastric and the intestinal mucosa. And these include gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin. Again, the hormonal control help in secretion and muscular control of the GI system. Absorption is the final step wherein the end products of digestion pass through the intestinal mucosa into the lymph or the blood vessels. So glucose and amino acids are absorbed by with the help of special carrier proteins in a process known as facilitated transport. Water which is present in the GI tract is absorbed by an osmotic gradient. This implies that there is movement from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Finally, fatty acids and glycerol, which are the breakdown products of fat, are absorbed in a structure known as lacteals, and these are basically the lymph vessels present in the villi of the small intestine. Here is a summary of the absorption from the different parts of the digestive system. So just to go through all of these, certain drugs which come in contact with the mucosa of the stomach and the lower side of the tongue are absorbed into the blood capillaries lining them, and this happens in the mouth. In the stomach, there is absorption of water, simple sugars, and alcohol. Small intestine is the principal organ for absorption of nutrients. The digestion is also completed here, and the final products of digestion such as glucose, fructose, fatty acids and glycerol and amino acids are absorbed through the mucosa into the bloodstream and the lymph. And finally, large intestine serves as an absorption site of water, some minerals, and major drugs. In this final section, we will talk about some of the pathology involved in the GI tract. Jaundice is defined as yellowing of skin, mucous membrane, and conjunctiva of the eye. And here you can see the yellowing of the conjunctiva of the eye along with the yellowing of the skin. This condition occurs whenever there is an increase in bile pigments. And just to recollect, there are two bile pigments, bilirubin and biliverdin. These are the breakdown products of hemoglobin from dead RBCs, and so the causes of jaundice include an increase in the breakdown of blood cells. It also occurs in some liver diseases, as liver is the principal site of production of bile pigments. And finally, it can occur whenever there is an obstruction to the flow of bile. So to understand this, if bile flow is obstructed, it starts entering places which it is not supposed to, causing jaundice. Neonatal jaundice is a condition where jaundice is seen in the newborns. Some terminology that you need to be familiar with regarding GI disorders. Inflammation can occur due to bacterial, viral, or parasitic infections, and some of the parasitic infections which affect the GI tract are tapeworm, roundworm, threadworm, and hookworm. Vomiting is the ejection of stomach contents through the mouth, and this is controlled by the vomiting center which is present in the medulla of the brain. Diarrhea is where there is an increase in the frequency of bowel movements and an increase in liquidity of the fecal matter. This can occur due to a reduced absorption of fluids. Constipation is where there is decreased bowel movements leading to feces which are retained within the colon. Finally, indigestion is where food is improperly digested, leading to a feeling of fullness. This can occur due to a decrease in enzyme secretion, anxiety, overeating, or spicy food. The last disease that we will discuss is known as protein energy malnutrition, and this is sometimes abbreviated as PEM. This is normally seen among developing countries, and it occurs due to a deficiency of either protein or calories or both. There are two forms of protein energy malnutrition. The first one is marasmus and the second one is kwashiorkor. So let us take a second to understand the distinction between the two diseases. Marasmus is seen in ages less than 1. It occurs due to a deficiency of both protein and calories. It is caused when the mother's milk is suddenly replaced by a low-calorie and low-protein food. The clinical features of a baby who having marasmus is that the baby has an emaciated body, and this means that there is thinning of limbs, skin becomes dry, thin and wrinkled. The baby also has a decrease in the growth of brain and a decrease in weight. To contrast this, kwashiorkor is seen in ages of more than 1. Here there is a deficiency of only protein and not calories. The causes of kwashiorkor are when the mother's milk is suddenly replaced by a high calorie, low protein diet. The clinical features of kwashiorkor are very similar to marasmus. There is muscle wasting, thinning of limbs, and decreased brain development. The major difference here is that the child has extensive edema, wherein there is accumulation of fluid in body cavities, and this can sometimes lead to swelling of the body parts. These are two pictures that show the stark contrast between the two conditions, and here you can see the emaciated figure of marasmus, whereas there is swelling and extensive edema in kwashiorkor. With this, we will conclude our topic of the gastrointestinal system. Happy studying and Shubha Dina.